the night before. Tommyknockers, Tommyknockers, knocking at the door. I want to go out, don't know if I can, 'cause I'm so afraid of the Tommyknocker man. Hey cousin, welcome to Hate and Holler Podcast. I'm Dee, your guide into the shadows, and I hope you enjoyed our little poetic intro. That was the obscure children's rhyme, Tommyknockers, picked up by the illustrious Stephen King for his novel under the same name. Tonight we won't be discussing modern fiction from Maine, however, but the inspiration of it that deeply affects those folks in the Appalachian Mountains. Miner lore, and you guessed it, Tommyknockers. Before we continue, cousin, a few content warnings. As we dig through history, we come across humans being entirely human, including their downfalls, hatred, bigotry, and other darkness of the human heart that rivals the bleak, lightless tunnels of a mine. This episode of Hate and Holler references those historical events, including anti-Semitism, racism, and abuses. Listener discretion is advised. In 1673, Louis Jollet and Father Jacques Marquette discovered coal during their exploration of the Mississippi River. It wasn't until 1748 that coal was commercially produced. It was at the heart of most American industry, from streetlights to war material to locomotives. This production, like most in our history, is won on the backs of laborers whose names are only remembered by their families and as scraps of paper collectors deem notable enough to save. Coal industry wasn't just built on their backs. It was cultivated in their lungs and eyes, in their joints and tendons. It was built on their blood, sweat, tears, faith, bravery, and desperation, because they had to do what they could to support themselves and their families in a world and time that didn't give them many options. Coal miners were widely poor and undereducated. The mines were owned by wealthy white men, and the workers were a mix of poor white men, mostly Appalachians and immigrants, as well as black men. Post-Civil War, the whites and blacks were encouraged to work together, not out of any desire to encourage racial relations, so much as to discourage the white miners from unionizing. These poor men were paid pennies and paid themselves with their lives and the lives of their families and children to the open earth. Many literally dug their own graves. You see, when you open the dark heart of the earth, when you bring light to a place that has never seen light and perhaps never should have seen light in the first place, you take a risk. That risk these miners faced by bringing their faith into the dark with them. Not just faith in God, though while it is said there are no atheists in foxholes, there are very few in the deep dark of a mine either. These men also brought their faith in other things. Things that might be laughed at in the light of day, but down here in the shadows, the heart knows it's true, or hopes it is, because it needs to know that there is something beyond the coal dust looking out for him. Tommyknockers are one of those things that the coal miners believed in, or at the very least told stories about, to bring that spark of hope like a light into the mouth of a mine. While there is some disagreement as to what exactly these entities are, their commonality in folklore reached across history and over many areas and cultures, and that makes them a key part of learning about miners and the mines themselves. The earliest recording of these entities goes back to the 11th century tin mines in Cornwall. They were called knackers and were said to be either goblins or the ghosts of Jews, an ethnic group that in the poorest county in Britain was treated horribly through history and, as we see here, in legend. Knackers were said to be short, gnarled men, and if there was a landslide or a flooded tunnel, well, a knacker was the one to blame. Now, whether this was a goblin turned Jewish tenor in the 19th century retellings as an anti Semitic counter to the mythological parables of the good Christian farmer, or if it is a throwback to an oral history that we no longer have access to except through bigoted retellings, well, we cannot know. In 1548, General Agricola wrote the following describing knockers and their doings in Europe, which is reflected in modern folklore. He says, "Then there are the gentle kind, which the Germans as well as the Greeks called caballos, because they mimic men. They appear to laugh with glee and pretend to do much, but really do nothing. They are little miners because of their dwarfish stature, which is about 2 feet. They are venerable looking and are clothed like miners." He goes on to say that sometimes they throw pebbles at the workmen, but they rarely injure them unless the workmen first injure or curse them. They are not dissimilar to goblins, which occasionally appear to men as they go to and from their day's work, or when they attend their cattle. Whether mischief or aid, what we do know, cousin, is that the knacker or knocker didn't remain in Europe. In the 1820s, the Welsh and Cornish miners immigrated to America, settling in communities that reminded them of home, specifically the Appalachian region. Some say they brought knockers with them, whether simply by spreading folklore or by bringing actual entities under the name Cousin Jack. Others say they didn't need to bring such unnecessary baggage. The mines here were already occupied. They only needed digging up these spirits. Now in the U.S., the knockers were called Tommyknockers. Some have very different stories told about them. No longer were the landslides or floodings blamed on Jews. In fact, many miners declared the knockers to be beneficial, if mischievous, spirits. They attributed knockers and their knocking deep down in the mines to be warning signs, telling miners to get out before cave-ins or other deadly problems occurred. Some new or relocated miners refused to even enter a mine until they verified that there was indeed a knocker there already. They gave part of their food to these entities in hopes of winning their favor and to keep them from stealing said food and other items when the miners weren't looking. As with most folklore, another route was carved into the stone of story and culture. Tommyknockers in the U.S. were deemed not to be goblins or dwarves or other entities, but human spirits. They were the ghosts of miners, either warning their brothers of danger or angered at their life sacrificed to the mining company's greed. Ghosts in the mines is hardly a wild concept when you consider all the horror around the job that causes these ghosts in the first place. Workers' rights and child labor laws are far more recent than mining. Accidents happen, and as it is with the system, there's always someone to take a down laborer's place. The poor always need work. Black lung and other diseases of malnourished and overworked varieties were more common than fresh bread. Death was a close bedfellow in the mines on a good day. On a bad one, well, that's when disasters happen, and the mines and the dead call for blood en masse. In May 1902, 216 miners were killed in the explosion at the Fraterville mines in Tennessee. Although 26 had managed to barricade themselves in a side passage, at least 10 were still alive 7 hours after the explosion, but eventually succumbed to toxic air and lack of oxygen. December 1907, the worst mining disaster in history, took the lives of 362 men in West Virginia. As recently as 2010, 38 more miners were killed in a disaster in these Appalachian hills. Many sacrifices made to the mountains and the coal and the darkness, well, it's bound to produce ghosts. Belief in the knockers in America remained well into the 20th century. One large mine closed in 1956, and the owner sealed the entrance. Miners and their descendants circulated a petition calling on the mine owners to set the knockers free so that they can move on to other mines. The owners complied. Tommyknockers aren't the only miner lore that has been passed down through generations of hard-working men and their families. Other bits of superstition and omen include it being bad luck for a woman to enter the mine because certain women could put a curse on it. It's also bad luck to enter a mine if you met a red-headed woman on the way to work. Whenever a miner was killed in the mines, all employees went home and did not return to work until after the funeral. The crumbs left in a miner's dinner pail were supposed to be gifted with supernatural powers, probably due to their rarity. Powder smoke was recognized as a cure for whooping cough, and early miners celebrated the Feast of Mary Goes Over the Mountain and believed if it rained on that day, it would rain for another 40 days. The mine rat knew of impending danger. When they ran for safety, so did the miners. It was said that if a man had 6 senses, well, a mine rat had 7 or 8, and every time they ran, there was either a fall of coal or a gas explosion. White rats in the mine had talents unknown. They got into the feet of mules and stayed underground their whole lives. They stole and thrived on the food of miners. And a white rat in a coal mine was a sign of an accident to happen. Black cats and dogs in the mine were a sign of bad luck and that someone would die. They say a miner killed underground, well, his ghost will return to finish the job. And miners believe mules could see said ghosts and spirits that the miners couldn't see. It's bad luck for a miner to put his work boots on the kitchen table, and it's bad luck to whistle in a mine. Miners refuse to work on Good Friday because that would bring disaster to their family, and it's also bad luck to kill a spider. Upward air in the mine coming from underground with no apparent reason meant danger was about, and a sudden warm breeze in the mine meant a passing of a ghost. It's good luck for a miner to skin his back on an upboard, and it's also good luck to get coal dust in his eyes. Never walk under a ladder in the mine, especially if there's someone on it. Bad luck will follow. And to see a strange moving light in the mine is a sign that death is near. So cousin, if you ever find yourself near a mine, or looking at old photographs of your papas and uncles and cousins covered in coal dust, remember these hard workers and their beliefs that gave them what security they could find as they entered the darkness. If you enjoyed this little bit of history and lore, consider hitting that subscribe button for more of the kind. And if you'd like early access and a peek behind the scenes and beyond the story, come on over to our Patreon. Every dollar in the offering plate helps keep the mic recording. We appreciate y'all listening. See you next time on Hate and Holler Podcast.